Alright, so today I'm at Granville Island. I've got some stuff that I've got to do over here. And so while I'm here, we're going to talk about shooting in 30 frames per second and why the hell you would ever want to do that. So I gotta go get a coffee. So I'm going to go through the market, we can check that out, and then we'll talk about this. Alright, let's do it. Alright, my name is Ben Schubert, I'm a filmmaker based in Vancouver, and today we are talking about 30 frames per second. Now you're probably wondering, what is the difference between 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second, and why should I care about either of them? Well, the difference is 24 frames per second comes from cinema. Now 24 frames per second was kind of this mix of what's the nicest, smoothest motion we can get while using as little film as possible. Celluloid film is expensive. It's full of chemicals, it's full of silver of all things. And so you want to use as little as possible, but you still want to keep that motion nice and smooth. And because of that, because we've been using that kind of film in that format for so long, it has become our standard. When we think about cinematic images, we think about 24 frames per second. If they'd settled on 30 frames per second or 16 frames per second, which were options at the time, it could have been different. It could have been 25 frames per second, which would have been easier to calculate overall, but they didn't. They chose 24 frames per second for whatever reason, and that's irrelevant to our story. Today we're talking about 30 frames per second. So 30 frames per second is actually kind of a newer addition. It's part of the TV broadcast standards in NTSC regions, which is essentially North America and some other places. I don't know them all. Maybe I'll put up a list. Now, NTSC regions run their electricity at 60 hertz cycles. So for the longest time, TV actually ran at 60 interlaced frames per second. Now what that means is in the space of 1 second, you'd get 60 half images where basically they would divide the image into lines and then show half, then show half, show half. And that was just an easier way of broadcasting. Now because of efficiencies in broadcast technology, they can just do 30 frames per second. A lot of TV systems are still based in that. So things like news, documentaries, a lot of that is still shot in 30 frames per second. So now the reason why a lot of video cameras go up to 30 frames per second is because they want to offer a broadcast option and a cinematic option. So with the big push for everyone wanting to shoot that cinematic, smooth, buttery looking footage, the big question is, why the hell would you ever want to shoot in 30p? And there's a reason, but I kind of want to change my location slightly. So let's go this way. This guy's come and hang out with me. Are we buds? Nope, not buds. Not buds. So the first main question of why you'd want to shoot in 30p is maybe that your deliverable is in 30 frames per second, right? So if you're shooting something for news or for broadcast and your client or your broadcaster has requested that your deliverable is in that format, it's probably a good reason to shoot in that format, or at least to have your base timeline set up that way so you can export in that format. All right, I'm gonna get set up at these stairs. Seagulls. Seagulls and seaweed. Look at all this. Now my other 2 points about filming in 30 frames per second are actually about finishing in 24 frames per second. When I started off filmmaking, there were no DSLR video cameras yet, and the cameras that we did have only shot in 30p or 60i. That was the only choice. 24p was not a standard yet. That was still coming. We were just getting into the dawn of the age of HDV, which was like a lower quality HD codec. amazing. A simpler time, but at that time we still wanted everything to look like it was in 24p. And even though our cameras only gave us the option to film in 30p, we still wanted to finish in 24p to have that nice cinematic look. Now, using 30 frames per second footage and a 24 frames per second timeline is good when you have stuff that is happening in real time, that maybe it was acquired by another shooter or as another format for another broadcaster, for another client. Who knows why you have this footage? I don't. I'm not going to judge you for it openly. I don't know, maybe I will. But the point is, sometimes you have 30 frames per second footage and you got to use it. So here's how. You essentially just edit it on a 24 frames per second timeline, and that'll give you that cinematic look. And what that does is it essentially removes frames from the footage to make it look 24p. And so my last point, and this is the big takeaway from all of this, is there's a way to shoot in 30 frames per second that's actually cinematic. That's right, it actually looks good. And there's an easy answer to that, and that's to use it as a moderate slow motion. And you might be thinking, that's a dumb amount of slow motion. Now, the point of shooting 30 frames per second as a form of slow motion is that it actually just adds a certain level of weight to what otherwise seems like real-time footage. So it doesn't feel like slow motion, but it also seems a little dreamy and a little sleepy and a little slower than usual. But for higher quality projects, what I've been actually doing is shooting in 4K 30, and I'll do all the editing in 24 frames per second. But everything that's B-roll and everything that doesn't have any dialogue in it, I'll actually interpret that footage as 24 frames per second. So a few weeks ago I shot a video of springtime in Vancouver. I'll leave a link at the end of the video. And I shot that whole thing at 4K 30. Now, watching that video, it seems like it's all done in real time, but everything has a slight extra bit of weight to it, and everything's just a little bit slower and a little bit dreamier. And whereas I think it's important to also shoot at 120 or 60 or whatever frame rates you have available to you, but it's also important to understand how all your frame rates can work together and offer different things. So otherwise, I'm gonna get moving. If this video has been helpful, please give it a thumbs up. If you want to know more filmmaking tips and tricks and just follow along what all the weird stuff that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis, you can just, well, not a day-to-day basis. If you want to follow all the things that I'm doing, you can hit that subscribe button, and if you have any other tips or tricks about 30 frames per second, please feel free to leave them in the comments. Anyways, until next time, just scram. Just get out of here. I'm going. Okay, I'm gonna go now. Okay, goodbye.